You ever seen someone block an ambulance in broad daylight because they were mad about garbage bins and lawn height, and then find out her own husband was the guy dying in the back of that ambulance? She just stopped. That was our HOA president Karen. The moment the paramedics screamed for her to move, she clutched her purse tighter, adjusted her oversized sunglasses, and said, "Rules are rules." We all watched helplessly as they ran the stretcher around her SUV while every second ticked like a countdown to something none of us were ready for. That morning started like any other but ended with a gut punch so hard it silenced an entire neighborhood. I was in the backyard fixing a broken fence panel for my elderly neighbor Daniel Carter, a retired postal worker, and one of the few genuinely kind people left on our street. Daniel had asked me to take a look after a storm had knocked part of it loose. He was talking about his daughter Lena visiting soon from out of state, when his voice suddenly cracked and he grabbed his chest. The wrench dropped from my hand and I rushed to his side. He was pale, sweating, and struggling to breathe. I pulled my phone out, called 911, and shouted his address as I rolled him gently onto his side. Daniel lived alone, and the HOA never made things easier for him. They fined him for slow lawn mowing, and once even threatened him over a patriotic flagpole being too tall, but he always brushed it off with a chuckle. It was that soft stubbornness that made him so likable, and that same stubbornness that worried me when I saw the fear in his eyes. He tried to speak, but I told him to stay still. Help was on the way. I dashed into his house, grabbed a bottle of aspirin, and sat by his side trying to remember everything I learned from first aid videos. The ambulance came within 6 minutes, sirens blaring and lights flashing just like in the movies, only this time it was real. 2 paramedics jumped out, one carrying a defibrillator and the other barking rapid-fire instructions over the radio. They placed oxygen tubes in his nose and hooked sensors to his chest. While I gave them a quick rundown of what happened, the lead medic nodded and said we had a fighting chance if they got him to the ER fast. Nightmares started. They wheeled the stretcher toward the driveway, and that's when we saw it. Karen's SUV parked like a barricade across the entrance to the only accessible path out. Her vehicle wasn't just parked, it was angled diagonally across both lanes, as if someone dared to challenge her authority. She was standing on her lawn yelling at a poor landscaper about grass clippings, claiming they had crossed into community flower beds. The ambulance's horn blared once, twice, 3 times, and finally the paramedics jumped out, waving their arms, yelling for her to move. She turned slowly like a queen summoned from her throne, and snapped, "What is the emergency?" That's when I ran up to her, screaming at the top of my lungs, "He's dying, Karen, it's Daniel. He's inside that ambulance. Move the damn car." Her expression flickered, but she didn't move. She placed her hands on her hips and said, "I'm in the middle of something. You can't just expect me to drop everything, and you're not supposed to block the community grass zone anyway. This is why we have HOA standard." The paramedics exchanged a look, then grabbed the stretcher and began pushing it around the car through a narrow path along the bushes. One of them tripped slightly and the stretcher jolted, but they managed to keep it upright. They ran it past hedges and a decorative boulder Karen installed last summer that had already been the subject of 2 neighbor complaints. Each second felt like it was ripping time apart. I looked at my watch and realized we'd lost nearly 2 minutes to Karen's tantrum, and in a heart emergency 2 minutes might as well be a lifetime. Once the ambulance finally pulled out, I stood there, fists clenched, chest heaving. I couldn't believe what just happened. Karen huffed and muttered something about disrespect and stormed back into her house, not knowing, or maybe not caring, that the man she just delayed was her own husband. Back at my place, I couldn't stop pacing. Every bone in my body was on fire with rage. How could someone be so obsessed with power that they'd risk a life just to prove a point? I called Daniel's daughter Lena and told her everything. She was already on a flight, she said, after the hospital had called her directly. I didn't tell her what Karen did not yet. The neighborhood started buzzing within hours. Texts were flying, screenshots from doorbell cams circulated showing Karen's SUV blocking the drive. Multiple neighbors had video of the ambulance swerving and paramedics shouting. Karen's own neighbor across the street even had audio of her saying they can walk like everyone else. That night I sat on my porch in the dark, no lights, just the faint hum of guilt and anger still rattling in my chest. I thought about Daniel, about how many times he'd stood up for me against HOA nonsense, about the time he testified on my behalf. When Karen tried to fine me for putting up solar lights, Daniel was always the guy who quietly did the right thing, and now the people who should have helped him might be the ones who killed him. The next morning the hospital called. Daniel was alive, but critical. His heart had stopped in the ER and had to be restarted twice. The doctor said if they'd gotten him there just 2 minutes earlier, he might have avoided severe complications. That was all I needed to hear. Karen, meanwhile, was doubling down. She had the gall to send out a community-wide email claiming emergency services had damaged common grounds and that residents needed to be aware of emergency vehicle restrictions. She even added a line saying all residents, including board members, must follow proper vehicle protocols during personal emergencies. That's when the gloves came off. I downloaded the footage from my security cam, backed it up 3 times, and sent a copy to Lena along with a detailed summary of the delay. It was time the real story came out. I didn't know what Lena would do, but something told me Karen was about to find out just how deep her mistake went. The same HOA president who fined kids for sidewalk chalk and warned retirees about garden gnomes had just turned a neighborhood against her in under 60 seconds, and she didn't even know the worst part yet, that the man she'd nearly killed was the same one who had once begged her to be less cruel to the neighbors. That same man had stood by her when everyone else had stopped. But now everyone was watching, and karma wasn't knocking, it was about to kick the damn door down. The morning after the incident, the neighborhood felt different. There was no usual chatter, no friendly waves or casual dog walkers. It was like a thick cloud of tension had rolled through overnight and settled over every driveway and rooftop. Even the birds seemed quieter. I stood at my front window sipping coffee, watching Karen's house across the street. Her massive SUV was parked neatly again, this time within the lines, as if trying to erase the memory of the chaos she had caused just hours ago. But it was too late. People weren't going to forget this one. Not after what she'd done. Not after it nearly cost Daniel Carter his life. Karen had ruled our HOA like a queen in a castle, with a clipboard and an unlimited supply of violation notices. It wasn't just her obsession with lawn height or garage door colors. It was her complete lack of empathy. Over the years, she'd fined residents for ridiculous things like hummingbird feeders hanging too low, or someone's welcome mat being a few inches too wide. But as absurd as it all was, no one had ever been harmed, until now. Blocking that ambulance wasn't just another overreach of authority. It was dangerous. It was real. And it had consequences that were still unfolding. I thought back to my first run-in with Karen 2 years ago, when I had just moved into the neighborhood. I had installed a small vegetable garden along the side of my house. Nothing flashy, just a few raised beds with tomatoes, peppers, and basil. 2 days later, I got a formal notice on HOA letterhead claiming I had violated Section 12.4, alteration of side landscaping without prior approval. She demanded I rip the garden out or face a fine of $250 per week. I'd done my research, knew the city had passed a law protecting residential gardening, and showed her the statute. She scoffed, said the HOA bylaws were above city ordinances, and threatened legal action. That's when Daniel had stepped in. He was standing quietly at the edge of my driveway that day, hands in his pockets, and told her with calm confidence that the law was on my side. He said that if she pursued the matter, she'd likely lose in court and cost the HOA unnecessary legal fees. Karen huffed, spun on her heel, and walked off without another word. Daniel just chuckled and said, "You'll get used to her. But don't let her scare you. Bullies hate resistance." I had always admired him for that. He wasn't loud. He didn't post on the neighborhood forums or attend every HOA meeting. But when it mattered, he showed up. And now the irony was suffocating. The same man who had tried to reason with her time and time again, who had defended her publicly even when she made the most outrageous claims. He was the one she had nearly killed with her selfishness and arrogance. Later that afternoon, I got a call from Lena. Her voice was sharp but composed, the kind of tone that told me she'd already shifted into legal mode. She asked me to confirm the timestamps on the footage, and to send a statement describing the event from my perspective. I offered to drop by her hotel, but she told me to hold off. She had a plan, and it was better if Karen didn't see us together yet. The way she said, "yet," sent a chill through me. Meanwhile, Karen was carrying on as if nothing had happened. She took her usual afternoon walk, clipboard in hand, peering into people's flower beds and jotting down notes like she was inspecting a military parade. A few neighbors closed their blinds when they saw her coming. Others crossed the street or pretended to take phone calls. For once, no one smiled. She noticed it too. I could see the confusion on her face as she turned her head, trying to gauge what was different. But she didn't yet understand that something had shifted. The silent fear she once commanded had evaporated, replaced by disgust. By evening, word had spread to just about everyone. A few bold neighbors shared the security footage on the local HOA Facebook group, and the comments section exploded. People who had been silent for years were suddenly telling their stories. About Karen screaming at kids for playing basketball, accusing a Vietnam veteran of violating porch light standards, even banning a lemonade stand once because the sign used non-approved font size. Some of it sounded petty, almost funny, but layered together, it painted a picture of someone completely out of touch with the people she was supposed to serve. The most jarring comment came from an elderly woman named Ruth. She wrote, "I watched her scream at the EMTs while Daniel was dying. I had my walker on the porch and couldn't move fast enough to help. I've never felt so helpless in my life." That one stopped everyone in their tracks. No one knew Ruth had seen it all. Her comment got over 200 likes within the hour. Then came the real bombshell. Karen, in a desperate attempt to spin the narrative, issued a community-wide email. She claimed she had been unaware of the medical emergency, and that improperly parked emergency vehicles had created safety hazards for other residents. She then doubled down and added that the HOA board would be discussing new policy proposals to regulate emergency access in a way that aligns with HOA landscaping priorities. It was absurd. It was tone-deaf. And it was the final straw. I sat down that night and drafted a formal petition for an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't the only one. Within 2 hours, 15 neighbors had signed it. We needed only 20 to force a vote. Lena had already begun digging through the HOA bylaws, and from what she told me, Karen had violated at least 3 rules of conduct and potentially some state regulations involving obstruction of emergency services. She was in deeper than she thought. That night, I walked over to Daniel's house, which was now temporarily occupied by Lena. The porch light was on, and she stepped outside before I even knocked. She had a stack of folders in one hand and her phone in the other. She looked tired, but her eyes were on fire with purpose. She handed me a copy of her father's medical report, highlighted in yellow where the doctor noted the delay in arrival time. She said softly, "That delay could have killed him. I'm not letting it go." I nodded, and we sat in silence for a while on the porch swing. Across the street, Karen's curtains twitched as if she were watching. Maybe she knew things were closing in. Maybe she didn't. Either way, the war she started over hedges and power had finally come to her doorstep. Only this time, she wasn't facing quiet resistance. She was facing consequences. The entire neighborhood was beginning to stand, one by one, against the woman who had made our lives miserable. Not out of spite, but out of sheer necessity. It was no longer about garden boxes or mailboxes or string lights. It was about human decency. About whether someone who valued rules over life itself should be allowed to govern anyone. Karen thought she could write a violation notice for everything. But she was about to learn that there's no rule book for karma. And it had just arrived, right on time. By the time the sun came up on the 3rd day, the neighborhood had transformed from a collection of isolated homes into a network of angry, alert, and organized residents. For the first time in years, people who had never spoken to each other were meeting on sidewalks and porches, comparing stories and building a collective memory of just how toxic Karen's reign had become. Her hold was slipping, and she didn't even realize the scale of what was about to hit her. While she carried on business as usual, writing warnings about driveway oil stains and unauthorized Halloween decor, the rest of us were preparing for something far more powerful than an HOA complaint. We were preparing the truth. That morning, I received a call from Lena. She didn't waste time on greetings. She said the hospital had officially submitted Daniel's incident as a delayed emergency response due to obstruction. It was rare, but serious. The doctor's statement was included in a file she had sent me. His exact words were that the patient's outcome may have been severely impacted due to a delay caused by a blocked emergency route. Lena said it was enough to start proceedings if the HOA didn't act. But she didn't want to go after the HOA itself. She wanted to go after Karen directly, the person who not only blocked that ambulance but did so knowingly, and then tried to blame the first responders afterward. We agreed to meet at the local community center, a place Karen had banned from being used for anything that wasn't HOA board sanctioned. Lena said we needed to gather everyone who had witnessed the incident, plus those who had relevant past experiences with her. She wanted testimony, video evidence, and written statements. Within a few hours, we had nearly a dozen neighbors confirm they were coming. People brought screenshots of texts, photos of Karen's SUV parked in odd places, and even old citations that seemed completely fabricated. One woman had been fined for watering her garden too joyfully, whatever that meant. Another man had been told he needed to remove his son's swing set because it violated airspace clearance for adjacent properties. As people arrive, Lena stood at the front of the room with a whiteboard and began mapping out a timeline of Karen's actions over the past 2 years. As each piece was added, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Karen wasn't just difficult. She wasn't just strict. She was strategic. She had manipulated votes, scheduled meetings at inconvenient times for working families, and created policies that only benefited a narrow group of her closest allies, most of whom had mysteriously moved away in the last 6 months. It was becoming clearer by the hour that she had operated less like a board president and more like an unelected dictator with too much time and no accountability. In the middle of this, Lena's phone buzzed. She answered and stepped outside. When she returned, her face had lost some color. She announced that Daniel had briefly woken up in the ICU. He wasn't fully coherent, but he had asked a question. He wanted to know if Karen had been the one who stopped the ambulance. Lena hadn't answered. She just told him to rest. But she looked at us and said, with a calm, icy certainty, that she would make sure he never had to ask that question again. That night, Karen decided to escalate. She showed up at my house with a clipboard in one hand and a printed warning in the other. Apparently, I had violated noise ordinances by having too many people gathered on my lawn earlier in the week. She said she had received multiple complaints and that any future gatherings would require prior written approval. I looked her in the eye and asked if she knew who was in the ambulance she blocked. She paused, smirked, and said, "I'm not here to talk about your gossip. I'm here to enforce the rules." Then she slapped the notice on my door and turned away. I didn't argue. I just let her walk away, knowing she had no idea what was coming next. By the weekend, the story had hit local news. Someone had submitted the footage and the hospital's delay report to a popular neighborhood blog. From there, it had gone viral. The headline read, "HOA President Blocks Ambulance. Victim was her own husband." The comments were relentless. People called for her resignation, others for her arrest. But what really broke her facade was the video of her saying, "They can walk him in like everyone else." That phrase caught fire. People printed it on shirts, made memes, and someone even spray-painted it on the sidewalk near the HOA office before it was quickly removed. Karen issued a public statement through the HOA email system, claiming she was being harassed and that the footage was taken out of context. She blamed media sensationalism and suggested that people were using a family tragedy to attack her. It was so divorced from reality that it only fueled the backlash. Lena responded by formally requesting an emergency HOA board hearing. According to the bylaws, any board member could be removed for endangering the community or gross misconduct if 2/3 of residents signed the petition. As of that morning, Lena had over 90%. At the emergency hearing, which Karen tried to cancel by claiming she had a dental emergency, residents packed the room. Lena arrived with a folder so thick it looked like it contained a class action lawsuit. The remaining HOA board members, who until recently had rubber-stamped Karen's policies, now looked sheepish and anxious. The energy in the room was electric. Karen walked in late wearing sunglasses and carrying a neck pillow, trying to play the victim. She said she had been emotionally traumatized and could not endure verbal attacks from residents. That's when Lena stepped forward and read the doctor's report out loud. Then she played the full security video on a projector, showing the ambulance blocked, Karen arguing, the paramedics forced to reroute. No one spoke. No one had to. It was damning, it was clear, and it was impossible to deny. Then came the vote. One by one, the board members raised their hands. Karen's face shifted from fake sympathy to confusion to shock. When the final hand went up, she stood and declared that the vote was invalid and that she was filing a grievance. Lena, now holding an affidavit from the city's legal liaison, simply said, "Your removal is not optional. It's procedural. You're no longer president. Effective immediately." Karen stood there for a moment like she couldn't comprehend the reality around her. Then she grabbed her purse, muttered something under her breath, and walked out of the room. No applause followed. No celebration. Just a quiet, exhausted relief. Outside the community center, people finally exhaled. Lena handed out copies of the new petition for interim board restructuring. Daniel was still recovering, but the neighborhood wasn't going to wait for anyone to take back control. People who had once feared HOA letters were now stepping up to lead. A new era had begun, and it didn't need Karen's permission. She had built her power on silence and submission. But the moment she blocked that ambulance, she didn't just endanger her husband's life. She shattered the illusion that rules were more important than people. And that illusion was never coming back. In the days that followed the vote to remove Karen, something incredible started to take shape in our neighborhood. It was subtle at first, like a weight being lifted one feather at a time. People began waving again, chatting at mailboxes, even helping each other move trash bins or paint fences. It was like we were finally remembering what it felt like to live in a community, not a regime. Without the constant threat of Karen's surveillance and citations, neighbors stepped out of their homes with renewed energy. Children rode bikes in circles they hadn't dared to before. Lawn chairs started popping up on porches again, and someone even put up a wind chime, something Karen had once banned for being orally invasive. The place felt human again. But the real reckoning, the one Karen never saw coming, was still ahead. Lena wasn't done. She wasn't just satisfied with Karen losing her seat on the board. She wanted accountability. One morning, she called me and asked if I was willing to testify at the upcoming city council hearing. I told her yes without hesitation. The city had taken interest in the case once the hospital filed its official report and media coverage blew up. A community president deliberately blocking emergency services wasn't just unethical, it bordered on criminal negligence. A hearing had been scheduled to determine whether the HOA itself had been complicit, and more importantly, whether legal action should be taken against Karen personally. That same week, the mayor's office contacted Lena and asked if she'd submit an official victim statement on behalf of her father. She agreed, and in the days leading up to the hearing, she worked around the clock collecting additional evidence. Every email Karen had ever sent, every board meeting transcript, and every video or audio clip neighbors had saved suddenly became valuable. I helped by knocking on doors, gathering testimony, encouraging those who were still scared to speak. Many of them had felt powerless for so long that just being asked felt like justice. When the day of the hearing arrived, the city hall was packed. Reporters waited outside, cameras positioned at every entrance. The story had caught national attention by then. It wasn't just about an HOA president anymore. It had become a symbol of how unchecked authority could lead to real-world consequences. People around the country, even those who'd never lived in HOA-controlled neighborhoods, saw in Karen a reflection of every petty tyrant they'd ever dealt with. The hearing room buzzed with tension as the city council filed in and the mayor himself took his seat at the center of the panel. Karen arrived late again, as if on purpose, dressed in a gray suit and clutching a binder overflowing with papers. She was flanked by a lawyer, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. She took her seat at the front table with the stiff poise of someone still clinging to the idea that she could bluff her way out of this. Lena sat on the opposite side, flanked by residents who had come to support her. I sat just behind her, hands folded tightly in my lap. The proceedings began with a summary of events read aloud by the council secretary. The footage of the blocked ambulance played again, this time on a large monitor for everyone in the room to see. A hush fell over the chamber as Karen's voice echoed through the speakers. They can walk him in like everyone else. Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Karen just stared straight ahead, unmoved. When the video ended, the room was silent for a moment longer than expected, as if everyone needed to breathe before reacting. Then Lena was called to speak. She stood, calm and deliberate, and walked to the podium. Her voice was steady as she read her statement. She spoke about her father's long history of service, his love for the community, and how he had supported his wife even when she treated others poorly. She described the moment she received the call from the hospital, the fear in the doctor's voice, the horror of learning what caused the delay. Her voice cracked only once when she said, "He trusted her, and she nearly let him die to protect a shrub." The mayor asked if she believed Karen had known it was her husband in the ambulance. Lena said she didn't care. That was the point. Whether she knew or not, her reaction was the same. That was the indictment. Karen's lawyer then attempted to shift the blame to unclear signage and emergency access policies. He argued that the HOA had no protocol for emergency vehicles and that Karen had been overwhelmed, not negligent. The argument fell flat. No one bought it. Multiple neighbors had already testified that the paramedics had shouted at her, pleaded with her, and identified it as a medical emergency. The fact that she didn't move, that she never even tried, was enough. Then, the final blow came. One of the council members, an older woman who had reviewed the HOA's internal documents, revealed that Karen had deliberately rewritten sections of the HOA charter over the past 2 years without majority consent. She had overridden voting deadlines, rejected resident submissions, and even padded her board with yes-men who hadn't been properly elected. What began as a discussion about a blocked ambulance was now clearly exposing a long pattern of fraudulent leadership. Karen opened her mouth to object, but her lawyer gently touched her arm, signaling her to stay quiet. The mayor leaned forward and asked the final question. "Do you believe, Ms. Sanders, that your leadership has reflected the values of safety, fairness, and community trust that this neighborhood deserves?" Karen looked around the room, for once without her usual smugness. She saw dozens of faces staring back at her, each one marked by a memory of some injustice she had caused. She gave no answer. The silence answered for her. The council ruled that Karen would be referred to the city's legal review board for obstruction of emergency services. She was also permanently barred from holding any HOA or civic position in the state. But the most devastating sentence was public and symbolic. A formal statement would be posted at the entrance of the neighborhood, acknowledging her removal and the reasons behind it, signed by the mayor's office. Her legacy was not just undone, it was broadcast. As she stood to leave, reporters swarmed. She pulled her jacket over her face and pushed through the crowd, barking at her lawyer to get her out. No one followed. No one chased her down. The community she once ruled had finally outgrown her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, we gathered in the community park for the first time without fear of being fined. Someone brought lights, someone else set up speakers, and a table full of homemade food appeared without a single permit. Children played tag while dogs barked and neighbors clinked cups together. Lena stood near the edge of the gathering, smiling softly as she watched it all. I walked up beside her and said, "Think your dad would like this?" She nodded. He would have brought his folding chair and a pocket full of Werthers. We both laughed. The morning after the city council hearing, something subtle but unmistakable shifted in the atmosphere. It was like the neighborhood had taken a long overdue breath, and the tension that had lingered like heavy fog was finally gone. Driveways were busy again with people waving instead of glancing nervously over their shoulders. There were no clipped voices about rule violations, no phantom citations taped to mailboxes. The silence of suppression had been replaced by the comforting murmur of a community reawakening. The shadow Karen had cast over the neighborhood had been lifted completely, and as people reclaimed their spaces and reconnected with each other, it was clear that something more than just rules had changed. This was about dignity. And it was about time. I spent that morning walking past familiar houses that looked newly alive. Someone had hung string lights between two trees. A couple had set up a lemonade stand with their twin daughters and didn't worry about font size or sign alignment. Down the street, a retired Army vet named Roy was repainting his flagpole, the same one Karen had once tried to have removed for being too militaristic. He gave me a nod, and I returned it with a grin that said everything. No words were necessary. By noon, a message had circulated that the new interim HOA board, formed after Karen's removal, would be hosting a neighborhood gathering that weekend. There would be food, games, live music, and for the first time ever, residents could vote on new bylaws. No agenda set by a single person, no threats of fees, just a real meeting where everyone had a voice. The invite was signed by Lena Carter and the new board members, and the last line read, "Let's build something better. Together." When I saw the message, I couldn't help but think about Daniel. He was still in the hospital, recovering slowly but steadily. Lena told me he'd started physical therapy and had regained most of his speech. He was aware of what had happened but hadn't spoken much about Karen. According to the nurses, he asked about the neighborhood more than anything else. He wanted to know if people were okay, if the board had changed, if the streets were safe for kids again. The kind of questions that said more about who he was than any long explanation ever could. Lena had decided to stay in town longer than she originally planned. Her law firm had approved remote work for a while, and she was already helping the board review old HOA policies and procedures. Her presence gave people hope. They trusted her not just because she'd fought for her father, but because she had listened. She wasn't interested in revenge. She wanted restoration. Her leadership, though unofficial, became a unifying thread in a neighborhood that had been pulled apart for too long. Meanwhile, Karen had gone quiet. Her house sat eerily still, the blinds drawn tight, the front yard beginning to grow wild without her usual manic trimming. No car had moved from the driveway. No one had seen her outside. Rumors floated that her lawyer had advised her to stay low until the legal review was over. A few whispered that Daniel had served her divorce papers and requested a restraining order through his lawyer. While nothing had been confirmed, her absence spoke volumes. She was no longer feared. She was simply avoided. The weekend gathering approached like a celebration and a reckoning wrapped in one. People volunteered to set up booths and chairs. Local musicians offered to play for free. A food truck owner waived his usual fee just to be part of it. For the first time since I moved into that neighborhood, I saw true cooperation without politics, hierarchy, or competition. People were laughing openly, sharing ideas, and making decisions together. It felt like a community rebooted. The day of the event, the sun rose warm and golden, casting long shadows over the freshly mowed community park. Tables were lined with homemade dishes and drink. Children ran through sprinklers someone had rigged with PVC pipe. A whiteboard near the main booth displayed ideas for new community initiatives. Things like emergency preparedness training, mental health resources, and even a monthly kindness award to encourage better neighborly habit. Not a single mention of hedge length or paint colors. I spotted Lena near the grill, flipping burgers while talking with a group of older residents who were now eager to help with neighborhood planning. When she saw me, she smiled and waved me over. She looked different, lighter, calmer. As we talked, she said something I hadn't expected. She told me Daniel would be released from the hospital the following week and that he had asked to speak at the next board meeting. She paused, watching the kids play nearby, and added, "He said he wants to thank everyone. Not for saving him, but for saving each other." The moment carried weight. This whole saga, at its core, had never just been about one blocked ambulance or one corrupt leader. It had been about years of isolation and fear and the slow erosion of what a neighborhood is supposed to be. And somehow, through all of it, Daniel's near-death experience had become a turning point for dozens of lives. Just as the event was beginning to wrap up, a hush fell over the crowd. People started turning toward the far end of the park, where an unfamiliar car had pulled up. Out stepped Daniel Carter, supported on one side by a nurse and on the other by Lena. His steps were slow, but his smile was strong. As he made his way toward the crowd, applause broke out, tentative at first, then thunderous. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polite. It was real. Daniel didn't give a long speech. He simply stood on the grass, looked around at everyone, and said, "I was unconscious when that ambulance ride started. But when I woke up, I heard what this neighborhood did. Not just for me, for each other. Thank you. All of you." He paused, looked over at Lena, then added, "Let's never go back to silence." The crowd responded with cheers, some with tears. People shook his hand, hugged Lena, and for the first time in forever, it felt like the community was not just surviving but thriving. Karen didn't show up, and maybe that was for the best. She would have seen something she couldn't control, something she'd never been able to create: unity. That day became more than a victory. It became a blueprint for what the neighborhood would be from now on. No more petty power trips, no more fear-based fines. Just people looking out for one another. Weeks later, a small plaque was installed near the entrance of the neighborhood, mounted to the side of the community bulletin board. It read, "Dedicated to the moment we chose each other over fear. Never block what saves lives." Below it, there was a quote from Daniel, "Kindness needs no approval form." People still talk about Karen, but only in passing. Her house eventually went up for sale, and no one bothered to learn where she went. The property was purchased by a young family with 2 kids, who were welcomed on their very first day by a dozen neighbors carrying cookies, power tools, and stories about what the place used to be, and how it had changed for the better.